Firstly, thanks for being here today, Peter. We'll start with yourself, and I'm going to ask the awkward question that you probably get asked on every one of these, which is, you're called the fraud guy. So, can we understand how do you get that title? How does that happen?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of my career in insurance fraud on claims, and people don't like to talk about fraud in insurance. So I was always introduced to people. So this is Peter. He's the fraud guy. They say it really, really quickly. So I started off as a cop. I spotted that fraud wasn't getting the attention it should be getting from the police, and I set up my own business way back when, while I was still young enough to put the kind of hours it takes. So I set up a specialist fraud investigation business, worked mainly for insurance companies, banks. That was bought up by a loss adjusting company. I stayed with them, became their head of investigations. So I ended up running about a team of about 160 people, and we were saving our clients probably about 40-50 million a year. So everything was going really, really well. And then I decided that I'd had enough of the corporate life, which I mentioned before. It was one of those sort of eureka moments where I met a client who came over at a function, insisted on buying me a drink, and wanted to thank me for a brilliant job my fraud team had done. And it was a brilliant job, but I didn't know anything about it. And it was at that point I thought, I actually want to be dealing with fraud. I want to be seen, I want to be back at the sharp end. So I set up Peter Taylor Consultants so that I could investigate fraud again. I do consultancy and I do training as well. And I do spend I spend a fair bit of time with reform fraudsters and cybercriminals, and I do a bit of infiltration on dark websites and things like that. So I enjoy my life a little bit more now.
It's funny. So I've got nowhere near the same potted history as you do, but yeah, I stopped fraud here at Feedzai. One thing I was keen to go into, because you talked about it there, and we're going to touch on it now, is money mules and the general topic of money mules. So has that been a theme throughout your career then? You kind of talked about being a police officer at the start and realising fraud wasn't being focused on. Because how did you get introduced to mules and fraud specifically? Because the reason I say it is, one of my colleagues always says this, is no one starts their career expecting to become a fraud fighter. We all tend to fall into this, and I think because feels like a good thing to do and a good way to protect people, it's something that people tend to stay in. But yeah, I guess how do you go from being a police officer to actually seeing fraud and being on the frontier of it?
When I was 7, I wanted to be a fraud investigator. My mum bought me what was called a Secret Sam briefcase, like a secret agent's briefcase with a toy gun, a camera, and everything else. So I decided then that I was going to be a private detective come fraud investigator at the age of 7. So it was always going to happen. Then when I was in the police, I got into the CID pretty quickly. Didn't just deal with fraud, dealt with organised crime and everything else, but fraud cropped up. Probably most of it was individuals committing fraud rather than organised crime type fraud, which is where the money mules get involved in. So money mules for me weren't that much of a part of my life until I set up Peter Taylor Consultants. Insurers, it was claims fraud, so we actually managed to stop the payments before the money went, so the mules weren't as significant, if you like, in the insurance world then, albeit things have changed now. The mules do impact insurance industries a lot more than they did. How it really came for me was when I decided I was going to set up my investigations business, and I could see that insurers were really being ripped off, which was the early 90s. Then I decided I would research insurance fraud. So I went out and interviewed people that I knew, like former criminals and people like that, and I would say, how do they do it? What do they do? And I'd find out all the methods. So I knew people that would say scrap dealers and people in the motor trade. So I had a really good understanding of claims fraud, which is why my business was successful, and the model that we put in place at that time still runs now, albeit by lots and lots of other different companies, but it's still my model that I created back in 1990-91. When I set up Peter Taylor Consultants, I did consultancy, which is helping people improve the fraud teams, how they use technology, how they use behavioural psychology. There, as well as that, training. So I do training for fraud teams, but I also do investigations. I'll be quite honest, I did reach a point probably about 2015 where I got bored with fraud. I just felt that things were happening, but a lot of it, there wasn't a lot of new stuff happening, believe it or not, from my perspective, because a lot of the new stuff is just stuff that people have forgotten about. It's like, check fraud now is the big thing, particularly in the US. It's growing in the UK. I mean, it died out at one point, and it's really strange. It's things like document analysis. You use machines to analyze documents. So you've got visual spectral comparators that can tell you if documents are forged. You've got ESDA machines. They were a really big thing in the 90s, and now they're all gathering dust in a storage cupboard somewhere because we don't use live documents in the same way as we used to do. MOT certificates, car certificates, you don't even get them now, or vehicle tax discs. It's on the computer. So, but what I am seeing, and I've made a point myself, is that documents are starting to come back, and what happens with documents are starting to come back. So, as I say, for me, around about 2015, everything for me felt a bit boring. So I needed a new interest. My knees have gone, so it wasn't going to be sport or hobbies. And I got really interested in cybercrime. But instead of trying to come up with solutions just adapting my fraud experience, I decided to research cybercrime. What I actually first did was I decided I was going to take some cybersecurity training. I looked at the cost of that and decided that instead of spending the money on that, I would actually fund my own research project as a different way of doing it. So I decided the best way to find out is cut to the quick and go and ask the criminals. So I actually advertised on social media to say that I wanted to do research into cybercrime. I was a fraud specialist. If any reformed fraudsters would be willing to speak to me, I'd love to speak to you. And I ended up about 12 came forward, and I'd set a criteria. Now, for me, there's a lot of research and information out there, and there's some fantastic research and information. But usually, the main source is the victims. Yeah. If you want to know how to be a good boxer, would you ask the winner or the loser? I don't mean to insult the victims, yeah. But so we're getting information from victims. That's well documented, lots of surveys, lots of academic papers. Then the other one is that people will go and do prison visits and go and visit criminals while they're in prison. Police will do it, law enforcement will do it, see if they want to admit any other offences, but also from a debriefing and intelligence point of view. The problem I believe with that, having done prison visits, is that the prisoners themselves, they will help, but what they actually want is they want to get parole, they want to get out earlier, they want to look good, and no matter what conditions you set, or no matter what you tell them, they will still see you as the interviewer as somebody who can possibly help them to get out earlier or stop them being kept in longer. So I don't like that. I want them to actually tell the truth. So my rule for the people that I selected was that they had to be convicted. Yeah. So they had to prove they've been convicted, which was really funny. Some of them found it really funny that they've been asked to prove they've not got convictions, and now they've got me saying, prove your convictions. They had to at least be saying that they're reformed, because that's the best you can get, isn't it? Reformed. They had to no longer be active in fraud.
How did you prove this stuff?
Well, you can, but at least you can actually get a sort of declaration and set the stall out that if I think,
if you believe them,
whether I believe them or not. And then I did interviews with them. So the first interview was like we're talking now. No notepad, no recording, was just a throwaway really, and that was for them to. My purpose from it was I wanted them to know that they could trust me, because they could. Yeah, that I wasn't going to do anything underhand, and I wanted them to be confident and be able to disclose stuff to me without worrying, but also for me to gauge whether or not, this does sound a bit ruthless, they were actually useful, that what they told me was worth hearing, that it would confirm things that I already knew, it would teach me things that I didn't know, and possibly even teach me things that other people didn't know. But out of that, two of them were Walter Mitty's. They had no convictions. I don't think they were actually criminals, or if they were, maybe shoplifting. And if you steal something from W.H. Smith and then put it on eBay, that doesn't make you a cyber criminal, in my opinion. You're just a shoplifter that sold some stuff. So I eliminated a couple of them, and then had various levels of successes with the rest of them. But probably 3 or 4 were the most useful for me. But what I also did, the other discipline, was if I couldn't corroborate what I was being told from a second source, then I would kind of put that on a back burner, that it might be happening rather than it is happening. So I interviewed the guys and found out everything I could find out about organised cybercrime. And what I particularly wanted to see was how it differed from organised crime. So organised crime at that time was, mainly drugs, protection, and human trafficking, and that type of thing. Whereas cybercrime had that going on, but its difference was carding. You buy people's credit card details, stolen credit card details, stolen identities, and you commit crime with it. It was quite a different hierarchy, whereas the organised crime was very family based. You've got the lead, you've got the enforcers and everything else, and it's like a pyramid that goes down with the people at the top. Whereas cybercrime, and the main guy that I spoke to was a guy that I think you guys may be speaking to, called Brett Johnson, who does a lot of the circuit. He's become good friends, and I pointed out to him that the cybercrime gangs, a lot of them are actually like cooperatives. I had to say, Brett, you do realise you could be accused of being a socialist, which is always going to be worrying for Americans. But what we found was that the again, just for people that might not know, you might have gangs that are denoted by the area they live, and the gangs also create names for themselves. Whereas, and cybercrime now, again, has aspects that are similar to organised crime, but in the main, the carding aspect, the identity theft aspect, hovered around marketplaces. So you go onto the dark web, and you then go onto a marketplace. So that might be Alpha Bay. Brett Johnson's was called Shadow Crew, Genesis Markets, Silk Road. I think it's Silk Road 75 now or something. They've had more Silk Roads than they've had Rambo films. And these marketplaces are basically a website like Amazon or eBay. So so you have your preferred suppliers and you have your preferred buyers that congregate around that marketplace. There are things that go on with the marketplaces as well. Some of them make you pay a deposit via Bitcoin to stop you ripping other people off. They take a percentage of the sales that go on. But on these sites, there are 3 things that happen. Yeah. And often there actually, people will stick to just one aspect. So I call it the cybercrime triangle. And this came primarily from the conversations with Brett. which is that Cybercriminal 1, they get the data and they sell it. So they may hack the data, they may phish the data, they may use social engineering to get the data, and they may just jump on website faults, and problems and download data or stuff that is left visible that shouldn't be, errors by companies. So that's Cybercriminal 1. When I've spoken to them, they actually, a lot of them don't think they're committing a crime.
Well, they think they're all good. They've just got some data and
They've got the data and they've sold it. They've not committed a fraud. They've been paid for data that they got, so it's okay.
Do you believe that? Do you think that's them trying to say it, or do you think they genuinely believe that?
I one time would have done, but I think we're seeing a change in people now. And one of the things I have seen, because I'm an old dog, for a lot of people now, it's no longer about what's legal and illegal. It's what's right and wrong, and it's their right and wrong, not the Fraud Act 2006 or the Computer Misuse Act. It's whether or not they think it's okay. So, particularly people that say that do cybercrime around streaming, film streaming. Well, Netflix, they're just massive and they shouldn't be doing that anyway. They're ripping everybody off. So I'm putting it right. So I've actually got people that think it's actually okay. Now, again, I don't think, nowhere near 100% of them think that they're not committing crime. But a significant number of them do think I've not done anything wrong. Yeah. Albeit without them, there ain't going to be no fraud. So that's Cybercriminal 1. Cybercriminal 2 buys the data, commits the fraud. So they'll buy the data. They may enhance the data. So they might do credit searches. I mean, that's a great thing, again, particularly with the US. You can buy everybody's data. $2, and you've got the credit history, the credit rating, and everything else. So Cybercriminal 2, they will buy the data, use the data, commit the fraud. Yeah. So they'll clean out the bank accounts, clean out the credit limits, get all the stock, and buy stock, etc. And then Cybercriminal 3, and this is what we're here to talk about, does the cashing out. And that is, it's all very well having for cybercriminals, usually it's loads of Bitcoin or alternative coins are available. It's in a crypto account, which isn't as easy to spend as you think, and when you do spend it, it can still be picked up under money laundering. And whereas organised criminal gangs, they just got suitcases full of cash and they don't know how much they've actually got. A lot of my career history is about behavioural psychology and profiling, and there is a logic. If you think about the type of person that hacks, steals data, and their character, and then think about somebody who commits fraud, slightly different characters. But then the guys that cash out, particularly if they're using money mules, you've got to be really gregarious and keep 60, 600 or 6 people motivated, cooperative and obedient. So the cashing out, it seems to be where the difficulty is. Sadly, it also seems to be the bit where people get caught rather than when they're committing the fraud or stealing the data. So there's different ways of cashing out, which are using money mules, so to skip things across bank accounts. But we also they will use gaming sites. One that I was never aware of is just open an e-commerce site. So if you've got 20 stolen credit cards or details for 20 credit cards and they've not been reported stolen, you just open up an e-store and use them, which again strangely comes back to my old days in the police. If you dealt in stolen credit cards or stolen bank cards, then you had a tame petrol station cashier. And what they would do is, if anybody pays in cash, they would keep the receipt, not give it to the customer, and then put credit card transactions for all the cash equivalents. So you needed that was a way of turning bank cards into cash. So a version of that, really.
I don't think that when it's spoken about in the media, Mules is very much seen as part of the scam problem and the banking fraud problem. But as you've spoken about there, you've got these other industries that need it as well, right?
Yeah.
But how do you start from that bottom level of, and I say this having spent quite a while obviously on the banking side, this is always the problem. The focus, as you've said, the focus in law enforcement is often not going to be on fraud, because whilst it's a huge number, it's not necessarily the thing that you got the dedicated resources on. And actually, I think there's a similar problem on the other side, which is, for years, a lot of the investment was on money leaving the door, right?
Yeah.
Can I be confident that this person shouldn't be paying money out?
Yeah.
But actually, there wasn't that same focus on money coming in. So I think we see that shift now from a banking side, which is, and regulation drives it partly, but just as much focus on the money landing in.
Yeah.
What techniques are the police using today? I'd be really keen just to get your sense on how that works, because, as I say, we see that banking side of it, right? Which is, I put in a technology control, I go and try and figure out where you got this money from, and it's quite that systematic thing. I tend to not know the law enforcement side of it, so I'm just really
from my understanding, and I might be being unfair, but certainly one of the things I can say, which with reasonable confidence, is the police monitor the organised crime gangs, and they monitor their activities, and they make arrests. And when they make arrests, they don't just consider the offence that they're making the arrest for. They look for what other evidence they can find of other stuff as well. So they would look at what other bank accounts they've got, what the connections are, what's on their phone, what's on their computer. So, but it's still, it is a bit more reactive than we'd like. I mean, they work a lot closer with the banks now. You've got bodies like UK Finance as well, with lawyers, police, and the banks themselves. An important thing is to understand what is a money launderer. So if we went out left the studio and spoke to people outside and said, what is money laundering, we'd probably get a hell of a lot of different definitions. In the same as fraud, people are aware of what's around them. Yeah. So on the money laundering, we've got, I'll just give the two extremes. So extreme one, somebody steals £500 and has put it into his bank account and now wants to get rid of it before he gets snatched back. So he tries to find a friend who'll take the 500 and then give him back 400 of it. So that's your low end money laundering. And I think a lot of people think that the money laundering is an afterthought because it's part 3 of that process, but it isn't for the professionals. The professionals don't steal the money until they've got the money laundering sorted. Yeah. So everything's organised and sorted. So, and these are, they come away from this steal the data, from the cybercrime triangle. These are what I call the heists. It can all be done in like an hour, but it's all done the same day. So the different things that we'll do. So we talk about money mules. A lot of people will say, and we're seeing some good research that's come out to show that something like 10% of students have said that they would be money mules. They couldn't see a lot wrong with it. I'm not sure what other figures there are, but the number that have been approached in some way is quite high. So they're obviously targeted by organisations that are looking for money mules. So that's that's the students. But for the big time organised crime gangs, a student's bank account's no use. You can't put £1 million in or 100 grand into a student's account. It's going to flash, and you probably wouldn't trust the student that much anyway. So we've got sort of like moving along. Let's talk about the heist. So the heist, if they know they're going to do the heist, they've got the target. They're going to do APP push payment fraud, and they're going to rinse somebody for £1 million. Before they make that call, they're ready.
Yeah, they know where they're sending the money. Exactly. Yeah.
And the kind of things that they may have done, and we're talking about money mules, those money mules might actually be businesses. If you've got a cash-rich business, it's easy for you to, what we were talking earlier, weren't we, about food outlets, where they can just add to the takings, can't they? So the money looks legitimate. So you've got that, but they also will proactively seek out. So they will actually do research and find a company that is struggling financially. And they'll contact them and say, we'll take your business, your bank account, we'll take them over, here's 10 grand. And the guy will go, thank you very much. And we had a lot of this in COVID as well, because businesses were struggling, where they were being made offers they couldn't refuse. I actually wrote an article about it, where covering some research that had been done by somebody else that was really good, in Sicily, where restaurant owners were being told by the mafia, we own your restaurant now, but we're looking after you, here's a load of money, your family are all right, and you can still work here when it's all over. Well, what choice have they got? They'll target particular industries that might be struggling, so it might be going to 10 of those companies, and then those companies, it might then be going to 20 or 30 students. It just sort of, it is, there's even people like on standby to go into the bank and make withdrawals from accounts. So you might have somebody sat in a coffee bar. You probably have got somebody sat in a coffee bar out there with 5 bank cards in his pocket or her pocket, possibly even 5 bogus passports to go with it, who will, when the call comes, go into Barclays with that card or Santander or wherever and say, I want to draw 1,000. I want to draw 1,000. And then the money will be collected at the end of the day. They'll keep 1,000. They'll give them 4,000 to the gang. So that the money laundering itself is an operation. It's a real skill. And it isn't an afterthought. It comes last, but it's not a bloody afterthought.
If you're working in the police, for example, or in law enforcement, this is a very specific thing to try and get your head around, right? We do this day in, day out, and we struggle to get our head around it. But I imagine if you're working in the police, this will be one of 20, 30, 40, 50 different types of crime with different thing going on that you're doing at any given time. And if you're working in a bank on the front line, you're probably working how many hundreds of alerts of very different. So how do we bridge that? Do you think that's as important to bridge that gap, which is that you're going up against very advanced, skilled adversaries who just do this, but actually not that we don't necessarily have that same level of investment in the people that are trying to stop it?
Yeah, I think there's a number of factors at play. One of the things that gets neglected, I think, is there is a lack of research, without a doubt. Most research is done by academics, and it's absolutely valuable, but it's not done. My research was intelligence, so I'm following intelligence models and intelligence grading when I was doing my research. The other thing as well is the difference again between intelligence as well is you are also grading the person that is giving you the intelligence. Yeah. So the gathering of intelligence, in my view, is inadequate. It's not criminal and behaviour focused enough. So that needs putting right. I know that there are people in the police who know most of what I know, but they kind of like thought of as the nerd.
And that was kind of my point.
Yeah,
I'm sure there's people that have got it, but actually, is it contained in pockets? And then the reason I
yeah,
say this is
yeah,
my mother-in-law was an ex-police officer,
yeah.
and that's what she did. Right, she was a beat cop for most, and then did a bunch of different roles. But the thought of kind of she kind of says it herself, right? The thought of having to do that whilst managing kind of everything else, it's a very different mindset shift. So
Mm.
actually, yeah, you might have those pockets of people, but to your point, are they actually disseminating that knowledge across the organisations
Nobody's
or?
listening. That I actually don't think anybody's listening. I think there's too much in terms of sound bites and not enough in terms of action. And the problem the difference with fraud and cybercrime is nobody is knocking on the door of the police saying what you're doing about it. They're saying to the police what you're doing about violent crime, as they should, um, domestic violence, as they should, terrorism, as they should, and even antisocial behaviour. It's important. I want my mum to be able to go to the local shops and walk back and have a pleasant walk. I don't want her, harassed or anything else. So I think we put too much on the cops. There aren't enough specialists. But the other one, and I'll criticise the private sector for this too, is I've never is I'm going to say something now, and it might be a characteristic of me. When I started to look at cybercrime, I've never found it so easy to find stuff out. I've never known so many people willing to tell me what they were doing under the guise of anonymity, and it's never been so. And it's easy to check it out and corroborate it. It's easy to get rid of the rubbish. The stuff. If you are networking with the right people, but you can't. I'm sorry, I include myself in this, and it could be or not. You've got to live it, which I do. You've got to be part of it. You've got to. You're not going to improve the internet if you're not on the internet, and you're not going to solve cybersecurity issues and cybercrime and fraud without getting involved and seeing that. But the stuff is there, but people are frightened to look.
So I remember one of my previous roles,
Yeah.
and I think this is one of the really positive things, kind of switching maybe away from the law enforcement, actually the banking side. I remember if we're sat here maybe 7 years ago, even 6 years, 5 years ago, I remember repeatedly trying to get fraud awareness onto our website. Right?
Yeah.
And it was there, but a bit to your point around from a law enforcement perspective, you've probably got these people that know a lot, but they're in a corner somewhere and seen as the nerds.
Mm.
The fraud awareness and the education was there, but it was parked off in a part of the website that no one would ever actually be able to find. And the irony was people weren't going out and seeking it because no one did talk about it quite as openly as it did now. I remember that was one of the biggest shifts. If I kind of compare that to now,
Yeah.
I get plenty of emails from every one of my banks about fraud. If I log in, I see the warnings. I do think the education and awareness, I completely agree. I think one of the shifts that happened, which is good, is we talk about it now.
The banks are doing some cracking stuff, and I take my hats off to the people that have made that happen in the bank. But they only got permission because of regulation and law and the need for stronger customer authentication. And the first thing they did was, we can't afford it, it's not viable, people shouldn't be stupid. And they were kind of forced into it. Some of the banks led on it, but other banks were forced into it, and some of them still haven't got there, I don't think. But it's worked. And yeah, we've got a huge fraud problem, but it'd be a lot worse if we didn't have it. But they had to be led kicking and screaming to actually introducing it. And that's not the fraud people, that's the C-suite, the decision makers. And again, I think that can be a problem. A lot of the decision makers don't understand fraud. What I will say is, if the police aren't going to do it, who is? Because the police should be doing it. They shouldn't be doing everything. Banks, insurers, organisations need to take care of themselves to a degree, and sometimes they need to lead on it. But I still think that the person that comes knocking at your door and says, "I've come to arrest you," it should still be the police. And I don't think it's down to sort of individual police officers, but I think police leadership needs to ask itself, 40% of crime in the UK now is fraud. We're not, we're not dealing with it, and if you don't deal with something, it just gets bigger. So, we can't keep saying, well, what we can't do is steal the resources off something else that is equally important to sort out fraud. Somebody somewhere's got to put their hand in the pocket and say, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to, actually improve fraud. And no, we're not going to take it off Peter to pay Paul. We're going to actually, this is new funding. So it's got to be the funding expertise. You mentioned training. I'm sorry, but the majority of training that I see in companies is a 20 to 30 minute e-learning module. It's great. It's fabulous. But they need to see it every month if it's going to actually do any good. Seeing it when you join, the same time as you talk about where the fire extinguishers are, it's no use whatsoever. You've got to do workshops. You've got to get people involved. I keep saying this thing about the only way to fight fraud is to think like a fraudster, and that it helps. So certainly with the training that I do, I'll do a workshop. So if I'm doing a workshop for a school's body, then I'll split them into syndicates and I'll say, how would you rip off the school? And then let them think about it and then work it through. And once they can actually see that fraud is possible in their environment, we can then think, well, how are we going to spot that happening? And then what are we going to do about it? I think a lot of training for fraud investigators at the moment, we're teaching them what they already know and teaching them very little that they don't. But they get a certificate and they get letters after the name, like I have, which, if they were rookies, that's fine. But if they're really experienced, maybe they should be learning about other things. And a big one, I think, is when I first was called in by an online retailer, I was shocked by what the online retailer had. Device detection, geolocation, email age, and it was brilliant to me, but I'd not seen that in insurance at that time, which it now is, but they didn't have loads of things that we had in the insurance side that I was able to then help the online retailer with. So it's that crossover. Another thing, though, that I would like to mention is that when I started off in fraud investigation, we did a lot of work around deceptive behaviour and using behavioural psychology, and it really, really improved what we were doing. Then along came the technology, the analytics and rules, machine learning, data mining, data matching, and that took us on a quantum leap that we'd have never got to without the technology. So the technology probably has saved a lot of people's bacon with fraud, but we need to now get back as well to reach the next stage. We've got to be thinking about behaviours a lot more. Another one that is a problem, by the way, for me, is Companies House. You can just register a company like that, and there's a guy called Graham Barrow who puts a lot of research out there, and he'll find an address that's got 11,000, a flat that's got 11,000 businesses registered there. So Companies House is a major problem. And again, the government said they're going to fix it. But there are things that we could pick up, and it is behaviours. So one thing from a money laundering point of view, and for things like, say, the bounce back loan frauds and the COVID loan frauds, is that a lot of those, if you actually look, you'll find that shortly before the loan application was made, there will have been a change of directorships, and it'll be somebody completely unrelated to the rest of the business, and then they might be featuring on 20 businesses. So I think we've got to go hunting for them.
Just on that, I think the behavioural side is massive in fraud generally. And again, I think we look at the behaviour side a lot from the victim's perspective.
Yeah.
We always tend to look at this and say, right, well, how do I find someone that's falling for a fraud? How are they going to behave?
Yeah.
How are they going to move their mouse and type? And there's all this wonderful technology that you can use. We tend to talk about mules as that bottom bit. It's students that are getting 50 quid because they gave their account away and almost the volume. But there are multiple layers to this.
Yeah.
But we always tend to have the same messaging to everyone, or just not enough messaging. How do you think the behavioural science can play into that? Because I very rarely see proper advice and guidance about here is the consequences of becoming a mule. I think that bit is almost missing sometimes, or it's not talked about enough. Like how do you bring that behavioural science into it? Because I think it's going to be absolutely fundamental if we ever want to make a dent.
One of the criminals that I interviewed, he took £250,000 from his employer and took it out over a period of a year. I'm not sure what his wages were. I would imagine around about 40k per annum. And he was in the finance team. So he was aware money laundering alerts might kick in. So what he did was he rang his bank and said, I'm doing some extra projects at work, so you're going to see money over and above my wages going in. And they did nothing. Oh yeah, he told us about that. But 40 grand, $250,000. And do you know how he got caught? He decided to buy a car, cash.
So there's nothing to do with...
Bank didn't spot the fact that he took 25 grand out in cash with the money laundering regulations. The second-hand car dealer dobbed him in. Your Arthur Daly dodgy car salesman had a better money laundering system and better ethics than I'm not going to name the bank, than a specific bank. One thing I'm conscious of with time, so tune into this bit, if you only tune into one bit of this conversation, is the biggest problem with money laundering is that the professional money launderers, the big hitters, their system always includes and completely relies on bank managers that are on the payroll from every bank in the UK. So every time you see somebody that's maybe getting caught or a big scam, there's a bank manager in that plan.
One single thing is never going to be enough to stop this, right? Be it the problem of mules or fraud. You've just raised another one there, right? Again, we often talk about the cybercrime controls and things like this because this is seen as a internet-enabled thing. But actually, there's potentially a fallback to bricks and mortar in cases, and it goes across a number of different areas.
Yeah.
Just on that prevention side of it, and we've touched on it a few times, but I think there is good stuff that is being done and can be done and kind of improved. The analytics side of it is massively powerful. So it'd be good to touch on that quickly around kind of what your experience of that has been. Speaking personally, I think one of the things that I found kind of amazing, having seen this in the front line, is when you give people that are got the right knowledge and understanding and the willingness and appetite to go and hunt this stuff.
Yeah.
The results you can get can be really powerful. I've personally seen one analyst kind of sat there just looking at something as simple as devices, right?
Yeah.
Confirm mules use these 10 devices. Who else in the bank has ever touched these 10 devices?
Yeah.
Almost 100% hit rate on those also being mules.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we tend to think of this as trying to boil the ocean in a massive thing. But actually, I think when you look at some of the technologies, there's some really good, simple things that you can do.
Yeah.
And a lot of it goes from once you've confirmed something as a mule, how do you then branch that out? How do you go and find the rest?
Well, yeah, you've got things like you can match devices, emails and things like that. But there's also there are the behaviours of what a money mule will do. If you did something as basic as have the they always leave 20% in? Because that's how it works. It's 20%. So if I'm a money mule and I take 1,000, I pay 800 on, and I keep 200. Now, setting something to pick that up would not be very difficult. Why if it's as I say, it's 80% spend, 20% remain from money that's coming in from different sources. So looking at the behaviour. Again, this comes back to actually understanding how the mule teams operate. But as I say, the 20% it seems to be the most common figure, and again, even then globally, cybersecurity. So you can be talking about Albania, Kentucky in the US or whatever. It's 20%. Company's house turnover goes up massively suddenly when a new finance director comes in and another director goes out. So you can pick it up from there. Businesses, particularly cash-based businesses that are suddenly doing really, really well because the money's coming from somewhere else.
And everything you're spoken about there isn't necessarily a new technology or a new piece of cybersecurity thing that we need. I guess about the same thing, which is there's just a behavioural psychology element to this, and I think part of that could be really useful. I think one thing I often found at the bank was there's fraud fighters who are very passionate. They know an incredible amount and try and do everything.
Yeah.
But actually, would it help to have some of those other types of people, so behavioural psychologists or just other people coming in, actually the ability to step away from the day-to-day and give that one thought? Because I think that simplicity is sometimes what gets lost, because you are doing your job, and as you say, there's a million things happening.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think actually the academics and kind of law enforcement and banks can maybe just work together a bit on sometimes simplifying it, rather, because we tend to always think of it as another control on top, and
adding another layer.
Yeah, how much of this is stripping away? Having someone with a fresh set of eyes coming in to say, you made a great point there, which is just look at every time 20% is being left after a transaction.
Well, if the problem you've got is counter fraud works by committee, whereas fraudsters just get on and do it. And the truth of the matter is, there's always the Seymours. So you and I are chatting about this, but if you were in a fraud team meeting and somebody said, we can do that, 20% remainder, there will be somebody who'll go, I wouldn't do that if I was you. Or should it maybe be 21%? So, there's always somebody somewhere who wants to make it bigger, make it smaller, or spin it around. And I think we need to just be a little more willing to try things and see if they actually work. I think the other thing as well, let's be fair, is there's some really good organisations out there. In fact, to be honest with you, more of them are good than bad. So you've got banks that, with UK Finance, and they're working with the City of London Police. You've got tap into Portsmouth University's, I think, Criminal and Forensic Unit. They put out some cracking, great research. Dr. Nicola Harding's been doing some really good stuff with Lancashire University. And the one that's coming through now is coaches, older people that have been around to act as coaches to fraud teams and just help them, rather than somebody managing somebody's workload, actually managing what the problems and the issues are. And the reason that the police did it is that there isn't training available in what some of the older people know. That training no longer exists, and everybody else has forgotten it. So you bring in, people that have lived through it, for whom check fraud isn't a new thing.
I know we spoke a little while ago about there needs to be consequences for people. If you are a mule, there needs to be consequences at the end of it, because otherwise you're never going to solve the problem. It's part of that problem, the other side, which is it's hard to get that consistency or that confirmation of what a consequence for being a mule is, because the impact can be so high. I guess, does this play into the difficult job if you're a bank that you have to do, which is if you confirm someone is a mule, you've really got to be certain, right? Because you're not just going to potentially hurt them right there and then, you could change their life, right? And
You will change their life. Yeah.
exactly, and,
Yeah.
and the cost of getting that wrong. And again, this is where I think that if you're stopping a transaction, for example, because the worst thing is you inconvenience a customer. It's not ideal, but actually the customer can go and make that payment again.
Yeah.
Do you think that plays into the lack of kind of having that clear, consistent thing around this is the consequences? We will follow up. We will, because do you think there's a human side of that?
I think you're absolutely right that if there are that many money mules, are we going to end up writing a generation off?
Yeah, it's a lot of lives that you could.
Yeah, a lot of lives that you could ruin. The other one as well is let's not over focus on students. A lot of money mules are recruited by friends and family as well, so they know what they're doing.
Right at the start, which you spoke about when you've done your research, and I found quite surprising when you said it was the amount of people that think they haven't done anything wrong.
Yeah.
And I struggle to react because the sense I have is you're witting when you do this stuff to that point, right? You've been recruited in by someone, or you know what you're doing, you know what you're handing over, you're a grown up, etc., etc. And I think that's the interesting thing to wrestle with here is you are going to have those two populations. You've got people that are doing this knowingly exactly what they're doing, and then to some extent, as much as it's hard to believe, you may have a set of people that don't think they're doing anything wrong. And again, from an enforcement perspective, I'm not sure there's an easy answer to that balance, right?
So when I first started to actually use Twitter properly, got more into how I use social media, work-wise. Well, obviously, when I was doing the cyber stuff, you want to be on Twitter, you want to see what's going on, you want to be on Telegram. So the thing I first noticed was, again, when you first went onto Twitter, when I first started going onto Twitter regularly, was about 2016, 2017, and it wasn't. I mean, it's not great now, but there was a lot of stuff on it that was unexpected. But the thing that I noticed was sugar daddies. Yeah, I'm looking for somebody to look after, and sugar mummies. So I kind of just assumed in my naivety that this is like for sexual favours. And most people that I've spoken to think the same, but it's not. It's actually recruiting mules.
Oh, wow. Right.
Yeah. So I want to give you
a way of finding.
Yeah, I'll give you £1,000 a month, or I'll give you £2,000 a month. I just need you to do some favours for me, but it's not sexual favours. It's actually money mules. So I've checked quite a few out, and I've even responded to some to see what goes on and kept the screenshots and things. And the majority, well, the ones that I've seen have all been basically looking for money mules. The only thing that's crept in since then on more recent ones is people trying to do crypto scams. I've got a theory of people talk about the trickle-down economy. Well, I think we've now got trickle-down fraud because so many of the big companies and corporations are doing tax evasion, getting caught up for fraud. It's trickling down, and the people at the bottom end are thinking, well, why should I be straight? So I think we've got a bit of a dangerous mix going on with what's happening globally, and it seems to be hitting virtually every economy, doesn't it? So people are more susceptible to the idea of committing fraud. We've always taken the view that there's a tipping point where below which people will never commit fraud, and then might commit fraud, and then definitely would consider fraud, or definitely would do it. And I think that tipping point has moved considerably. But certainly when I first started investigating fraud privately, commercially, a lot of insurance fraud was motivated by negative equity in the housing market, and people saw making an insurance claim as a way out, or getting some more cash. So yeah, we kind of like we've got some bad things coming, I think. Having said that, in post 2007 and in the 90s, when there was I think it was a recession, it was certainly a real downturn. We did not have the technology. The technology can save us here. One thing I haven't mentioned as well, though, that is an important message, is fraud training shouldn't just be about the fraud team. It should certainly be anybody who's customer facing, anybody who's in, anybody who's customer facing, anybody who's in a finance team, that issues money, and ideally, probably HR and the whole company anyway. But fraud awareness training, it's for everybody to try and spot it.
When you speak about Mule specifically, I think there's a massive part which is social media, and actually, again, you look at using the technology, and the technology is powerful and what can be used. Banks are doing a great job with device, with machine learning, with behavioral kind of biometric, a load of different things being used. Who holds the can? Is it the bank that ultimately have someone on their books that haven't looked at properly? Is it the police who maybe haven't investigated properly, or is it the people right at that front, almost creating the shop window?
Yeah, I think they can fix it if they want to, but they don't, and I don't understand why they don't. Then there are loads of trigger words, the sugar daddy, the sugar mummy, the investment scams, and everything else. They can block it. So why don't they block it? I just don't see what they've got to lose. But I am seeing, and I'm not going to name anybody, I'm seeing paid adverts that are scams promoted, social media posts. So my understanding of promoted means somebody paid for it. So I think if you've taken money, then you should potentially be liable. I know there's lots of countries and lots of laws involved, but to me it's like you're aiding and abetting fraud or whatever, albeit without getting too technical, you can't aid and abet fraud anymore in England and Wales. But there should be some responsibility. I remember when I first set up my investigations business, we put an advert in our local paper, and we put the Northwest's best detective agency or whatever it was, and they got a phone call from the Warrington Guardian, and he said, you can't put that. Why? Because you've got to prove you're the best for us to use the word best. So she said, I'm not being nasty. She says, I'm just, So we put newest. and it went, but where has that level of responsibility gone? Two things that's driving me is, one, you're actually using it as part of your funding, Meta, LinkedIn and Twitter if it's a promoted advert. But the other one is, whose credit card's being used to pay? Is it another fraud victims?
Yeah, it's all a massive
and then you've got to get into chargebacks, and it's just a mess.
If I'm a bank, there's a clear consequence there, which is there's regulation that says you cannot do this. There is, and I think there's generally a willingness to try and do the right thing and protect customers. I do think that, to be fair to the banks, they are trying to do as much as they can there. With law enforcement, again, there's a clear consequence there. If you're not managing, you're not tracking this, you're not kind of affecting the problem, that is going to kind of show in the numbers, that is going to become the press. Where there isn't really a consequence at the moment for those platforms, and as a result, there probably is no one with the responsibility in those organisations, or if there is, they probably don't have any sort of budget. Or how much of this is going to be around getting the consequences right? We've spoken about consequences for the mules as being a way of preventing that. Equally, the other end of this is consequences for, as you say, people that are potentially profiting off of people becoming mules.
Well, the term we use is enablers, isn't it? They've got a legitimate business of some sort, but they're enabling crime and fraud. I'm not sure, well, what I did say to you earlier was they don't care, and there is this thing that it's our fault because we don't walk, do we anymore? We don't say I'm not doing that anymore. You can't take away my Facebook account, you can't take away my LinkedIn account, you can't take away my Twitter, you can't take away my smartphone. So we put up with this now. I mean, if you again, a change that I've seen is when sort of 5 years after websites came up, you go on the website, there'd be complaints, there'd be a phone number, there'd be an email address. You don't see that anymore. Actually, how do you report something?
I struggle to believe that in an organisation of that many people, there aren't some people that care, and I think actually that's why I come back to the same thing, which is there's an element of consequences of there being something that could go wrong, because that is what drives that trickle down, right? There's
Yeah.
again, I look at the whenever great work is being done, and there's so much great work being done, I think across different pockets of organisations when it comes to fraud, it's because everyone's kind of on the same page and they're trying to drive it, and there's always people that do want to stop it, right? But I think the challenge is exactly that. How do you get the C-suite engaged?
Yeah.
If you are one of their social media platforms right now, it might not even be that they don't care. It's just that this isn't top of the list because no one's out there going.
Absolutely agree with you there. That is the point that, and I may have even come across myself sometimes as sort of being angry that people maybe don't care, but they've got a lot on.
Yeah.
There's a lot to life, and there's more to life than fraud and counter fraud and cybersecurity. There's a lot of other stuff as well, and you're right. It probably isn't the priority. And it takes a while to get up. And I've had it myself where I've been working, organisation I've been working for, I had a major innovation that was going to cost money that I wanted the organisation to do. It looked like they were going to do it, and then they didn't. And when they explained to me why, i.e. something else had come up that required that funding, I accepted it. And I could see it. And at least he'd explained it to me. And that happens a lot.
A lot of what we've been talking about and we're going to talk about was kind of the industry as well as kind of law enforcement. I know we've touched on social media. The one that we probably haven't is then government. Regulation has been a big I think in many cases positive driver over the last few years in terms of fraud awareness, in terms of getting the right investment, in having the focus. And actually part of the challenge from that social media angle is probably that the regulation hasn't caught up in that space. But what's the government role in all of this, right? In terms of, cause I think to be successful, all those disparate parts are going to have to be brought together. We talk about the technology. They've all probably got bits and pieces of the information. They've all got bits and pieces of technology, right? And let's be honest, there's only probably one thing that's going to bring them together. So where is the government role in this? Because I'll give personal opinion, but keen to hear yours, which is, I feel like again there's an element of patchwork happening there, right? There's a bit in that bill, there's a bit in this bill, there's a bit in this consultation. So actually, if we want to really sort out the Mule problem, because I do think there's a big societal thing, right? The bit that scares me with some of this stuff is as we said before, the consequence of getting it wrong for the individuals, right?
Yeah.
Where is that government role in making sure that there's a sensible framework around not only consequences for everyone, but how it gets done, how you mobilise all these different people and parts.
So you're not thinking about the government as money mules, which is where I thought we might be going, and money laundering. They're not doing very well, really, are they? They produced actually a very good strategy document, and it brings a lot of things together. It explains things quite well. But it's a slow burner. It's talking about, over the next 10 to 15 years. But I'm glad to see that in place, and that is really, really good. I personally think they're actually making a mistake. I think it used to be pretty simple, which was if you've got fraud and it's benefits fraud, the DWP equivalent would deal with that. If it was tax fraud, HMRC would deal with that. If it was any other fraud, the police would deal with it.
And I guess for the benefit of those listening, those individual organisations, essentially, DWP would be the Working and Pensions Department, and HMRC would be the Tax Department. So the individual department responsible for that area of policy.
So we had that, and then we had the police, and that included the Serious Fraud Office, or the Serious Fraud Squad, I think it was. And then we've ended up now, we've got the Serious Fraud Office, we've got the NCA, which is the police. But there was a report on the government's approach to fraud just before the fraud strategy paper came out. And that said that one of the problems is we've just got an alphabet soup of departments that are responsible for things. And I think we've overcomplicated it, and we've possibly taken the American system where we've got agencies that should be cooperating, competing for the same funding. Yeah. So not necessarily, so I'm, how well that'll, that'll encourage collaboration. I'm not really sure. But I think we could. What I'm saying is, I've got to be fair. I'm absolutely great to see a full national strategy. Great to see fraud investigators being trained, standards being set for training, people going after the bounce back loans, the COVID loans. I've no complaints with what we're doing. My only reservations are it's a slow burner, and the trouble with slow burners is they often get turned off. But the other one is I would probably have been comfier if we had less departments than the myriad that we actually do have. So it feels to me, an analogy that I've used is I look at fraud now, and like you go to your GP, yeah, and if you want, and then they have a nurse who'll do your bloods. It's like we've got a doctor for noses, a doctor for coughs, and a doctor for rashes instead of a GP. It's like we wouldn't do that with GPs. We've got specialists, like brain surgeons and cancer surgeons and everything else. But I think we're losing that starting point of the GP. So to me, it should be the police, and officially it is because we've got the revised action fraud via capita. But it should actually start with the police. Another one I'm going to say, which is a bit controversial: have we really got all this fraud that we say we've got? Because most of it's unreported fraud. Yeah.
When you say have we got all this fraud,
the fraud figures are something like 4 million, or
cases. You mean?
Yeah. Have we?
As in, you think it's underreported, or?
Well, everybody says it's underreported because most people don't report it, and that's why we have the unreported numbers added to the reported numbers.
Yeah.
But let me tell you this: is how do you, if you're a fraud investigator and you get, I've got a fraud here, yeah, have a look at it. The first thing you do is you look at it and say, is this a fraud? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times it isn't. I don't know whether that's your experience.
I wouldn't say a lot of times. Obviously, there's going to be an element of first party with. I guess this is maybe where, coming from a banking background versus the insurance side, you're historically probably looking at a very different piece.
Yeah.
But I think from the banking side,
I'm thinking from the crime as well, company frauds and everything else. A lot of them aren't frauds. They're not fraud. I get people. It stops a little bit now, but I had so many people contacting me when, during COVID, saying I've been defrauded. I've, put this on a plate for the police and they won't do anything. Will you have a look at it? And it isn't fraud. It's a customer complaint. You don't know it's a fraud until you have a look at it, and nobody's having a look.
I guess again it will depend on industries, right? As I say, I think if you look at the stuff that UK Finance, for example, do with the banks, I think there's good rigor around putting that together, reporting it. So I think
but that's 0.5% of UK's fraud. Is the UK Finance stuff, and the UK Finance stuff is great. And as I say, there's other great stuff. There's a paper, I think it's Crow, and the University of Portsmouth, and some other people have put together, and that estimates the cost of fraud in the UK is up to 219 billion, and it categorises it all and everything else. And I really like the way it's been put together. I like the context and everything else that it adds. But I do worry that, I'm just going off my experience as a police officer. So I was seeing every type of fraud as a police officer, albeit not in high volumes, and quite a lot of them. They weren't. They were a business dispute. Now, unfortunately, as well as that, I do accept that sometimes the police have written fraud off or got rid of it by saying, no, it's just a civil dispute, civil matter or whatever. But I just think we actually start off by not being sure whether we've got fraud or not, because it's at the moment you report fraud to Action Fraud, they give you a case number and off it goes. They never come back to you and say that's not actually a fraud, as far as I'm aware.
As an industry, there is that collaboration to provide consistent data in. So yeah, maybe if we look at holistically fraud across the country, I can appreciate you've probably seen a lot of these other pockets. But yeah, I guess speaking from that banking perspective specifically, I think actually that's been one of the positives of the last kind of however many years is getting that consistency right, and there's more work being done around that consistency.
Yeah, I mean the insurers pioneered it. Yeah. The insurers were quicker than the banks, but I think they were exposed in a different way, exposed a lot more. I remember though the first insurance company I spoke to said that they didn't have any fraud, and then the second time I met them, they admitted they did have fraud, but they were frightened to investigate it in case it affected the share value. If the public knew that people were defrauding that insurance company, that's how naive they were. I mean, that company is actually probably, in my opinion, one of the best fraud resilient companies in the UK now. So yeah, I think the insurers have done well because their advantage, I think, has been that they've got the money still with them a lot of the time. So it's economically viable. We also need, your local paper and it says 16 arrests this week, we need to see some money mules in there. I think it will, that until we get to that point, it's going to be hard. I think the prevention, i.e. discouraging people from being money mules, I think some of them will wait until they actually see somebody actually getting caught.
I'd summarise it, and keen to get your view on this. I'd summarise it as the problem's not going away, right? Fraud's not going away. The problem money mules is not going away. I think what we've seen, I don't think it's about stopping the mule problem or getting rid of mules. We're never going to get rid of mules, right? We're never going to have this wonderful financial system where they don't necessarily exist. But it's how do you get the right controls and measures in place to make it harder, to make it tougher, to protect more people? And I think the overarching theme for me, probably this whole conversation, has been it can't be done in those pockets. There's an element of simplifying it. There's an element of just getting the right people together and arming them appropriately to do it. But part of this challenge is it tends to be so fragmented right now and in so many different places. And I think there's so many people actively trying to do the right thing. And it's how do you start to bring those pieces together? How do you bring the relevant people? And good work is being done around kind of the people in the banks and law enforcement. And even, I'm sure there are plenty of people within social media who do want to make a difference. But how do you give them a voice? How do you arm them in the right place and bring that all together?
Yeah, but the universities, again, are part and parcel of it. And again, they care about their students. They don't want to see the students' lives adversely affected. So one thing I will add, though, is I have a feeling we've actually hit a turning point in the last year with fraud, and I think we will start to eat away. It might still get a little bit worse, but I think we're in danger of actually being able to reduce it significantly. It'll still be a lot higher than it was because, again, in my day, originally it was 1% of all crime was fraud. So and that applied until maybe 15 years ago, and then the internet came along and it was like the blue touch paper and watch the fireworks go. But I think we've got to be fair to ourselves, as I say, that mass internet usage, sort of 1999, 2000, when everybody was getting a computer. So that's only 23 years ago. We've got to, we're kind of like the Formula One car. We can do a pit stop, but we can't come off the track for a service. The information's there. We just got to be using it. We've got to use the technology, and we've got to empower the people. We need to do something about mules and students and that end of things. But we also need to do something about the big operators, because if they can't get students, they'll go for disabled people. I know a guy near where I live, and he was 64, and he'd become a money mule. Help to make ends meet. So I think we've got to be thinking about, when if we are successful with the students, where are they going to go instead? What are they going to do instead? And be thinking about that and cutting them off at the pass. But still, the best thing you can do is, if you've got the people that are running these big teams, putting them in Wormwood Scrubs or wherever, does make their life a lot harder.
Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for being here, and I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thanks so much.